I would like to ask Vendula Hnídková to the stage and introduce her quickly. Vendula Hnídková is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham, where she examines garden cities movement in Central Europe. I think that's a topic not many people are familiar with. Maybe she's the only one, and then we will be as well a bit. Since 2005, she has worked as a research fellow in the Institute of Art History at the Czech Academy of Sciences, and in 2017 to 2018 as an assistant. Professor, I'm sorry, as assistant professor at the Academy of Arts, Architecture and Design in the Umprum in Prague. Her research focused on the history and historiography of modern architecture in the 20th century and its social and political and economic context, especially in Central Europe. Publications by Vendula include Moscow 1937, Architecture and Propaganda from the Western Perspective from 2018, and National Style, Arts and Politics from 2013. And of course, about Pavel Janka, Outline of an Epoch from 2009. We actually were inviting her to speak about Pavel Janka in the first place, but then she said her recent research is about the garden cities in this period where we locate the functionalism. And so we said, okay, that's interesting, another few angle on that, and we're very curious to hear about it from you, Vendula. So thank you very much for joining us. And
vielen Dank.
Ja.
Ich sehe, dass ich hier heute sein
Aber
kann.
Sie werden, you will do it
Yeah,
in German?
I will switch into English.
Oh, you will switch into English because our translator
I just thought it's polite to start in German.
It's so polite. I'm so sorry. I don't want to be impolite. It was just like looking at our interpreter, and he was giving me.
No, it's much more comfortable for me to speak in English.
Very well. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here. I'm really proud, and I'm always glad to leave Birmingham, actually, in this Brexit period, especially. But I would like to start that I also need to thank Helena, because her talk was a perfect introduction to my Garden Cities movement. Because when I was invited to talk about national style in relation to Bauhaus, I actually was quite confused. I just didn't know how to present it in that way. So instead I offered my recent research, and I think it's like the missing brick into the history of Czech architecture, of modern architecture, and I will try to tell you why. It's just the beginning of the research, so I would be very happy for any comments. Is there someone who could open it? It was working before when I downloaded the file. How did the tidy, orderly maintained, and indeed comfortably garden suburbs from the interwar period transform into an uncomfortable heritage in Czechoslovak art historiography? What were the key reasons for an initial appearance and a subsequent disappearance of the Garden City movement from the Czech leader narrative of modern architecture and town planning? This paper tries to shed some light on the rather turbulent past that made this reform vision become a rather invisible scar on the rather polished image of spectacular modernism that is held in high esteem in the Czech lands. Eclipsed by focus on vast urban transformations, important architectural competitions, daring ideas of collective premises, spectacular family houses, or monumentality of public buildings in functionalist style, almost exclusively, the Garden Cities seem not to play any significant part in the history of Czechoslovak modern architecture. But the dramatic story of Garden City movement in the Czech lands spans a wide narrative between Ebenezer Howard's idyll and its eventual contradictory misuse in the 1930s. In brief, the Garden City vision outlined by Ebenezer Howard in his pamphlet Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform from 1898, responded to a lasting demand to improve the living conditions of the underprivileged classes in the industrial centers in the United Kingdom. Howard's scheme marked an immense advance on any type of industrial town that proceeded in an idea of uniting two key elements, namely town and country, creating a new urban environment that would benefit from both the beauty of nature and social opportunities in towns. To achieve the outlined objective, Howard calculated precisely the expected population of the new settlement on 32,000 inhabitants to be able to sustain agriculture and industrial production in the outlined cities. In this respect, the vision of a garden city differs from any subsequent garden suburb. Moreover, in the principles of the self-contained and self-governed garden city, Howard assumed that an efficient reform must be ultimately based on a new social order. Already in 1903, the first garden city, Letchworth, was established in Hertfordshire, some 50 kilometers north from the center of London. Initiated by Ebenezer Howard, the town was laid out by the architects and town planners Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker. Apparently, however, this reform vision was too unusual to be immediately replicated by any sympathizers outside the United Kingdom. Still, there was a strong belief in the advantages of the garden city concept that many architects and other reformers during the Garden City and Town Planning Association, founded in 1913 by Howard to promote the urban and social concept worldwide. So we are getting a global history. And thought the idea of a garden city had a lasting impact on urban decentralization. The precisely calculated principles by Howard, in fact, proved to be too radical to be translated into reality in its complexity. Thus, the garden city utopia was commonly reduced to middle-class garden suburbs and garden villages with picturesque cottages and extensive green environment. In the Czech lands, I'm sorry, but in the presentations they are missing all the names that I have added, so it's the problem between Mac and other PCs, so I'm really sorry, but you will miss most of the quotes. Okay. In the Czech lands, a personal continuity of sympathizers prevailed promoting the reform visions coined by Ebenezer Howard. In many countries, there was a key figure who enthusiastically advanced the garden cities, and in the Czech lands, the early proponent of garden cities was the architect Jan Kotěra. It is highly probable that the distinguished architect became familiar with the English utopia by his relationship with Hermann Muthesius, the German architect and author who was based in London and published Das Englische Haus. The first remarkable attempt to build a garden city in the Czech lands was initiated by Jan Kotěra when he was approached by a wealthy client, Tomáš Baťa, the leading industrialist in a remote town, Zlín. And this is the common image of Zlín that every functionalist lover gets instantly, but there was a predecessor. In 1911, Kotěra remodeled Baťa's own residence there, and soon after, in 1915, the architect received a commission for an ambitious town extension. Yet implementing a garden city into a company town sounds not as an experiment, but a total contradiction. But during First World War, such an urban fusion seemed to be envisioned in a joint utopia shared by Kotěra and Baťa. Then, in a brief period shaped by a war economy, military supplies, and a common anxiety within society, emerged a vision of founding a garden city in the vicinity of Baťa's factory in Zlín. And those who know a little more about Baťa would be surprised that immediately next to the second factory entrance there was a pub plant, and never realized, because Zlín was famous in the interwar period for its sobriety. Alcohol was restricted, there was a prohibition in Zlín. So in the garden city it was possible. As many architects do, Kotěra took into account the local conditions and conceived a new development on the hills next to the factory premises that are called Letna today. Low-density housing with gardens, a green belt, a variety of public buildings, and proximity to the both work and nature were the key features of the new urban pattern. Moreover, the new settlement was to be equipped by 2 farms run on a cooperative principle that would not only provide additional food in times of war economy, but also enable the inhabitants of rural origin to adapt in the industrial town more easily. Yet commissioning a garden city by an industrial tycoon is an oxymoron, and the eventual output in Zlín corresponds with the initial misunderstanding of the socially sensitive scheme. And here you see why. This is the first stage designed by Kotěra, and after his death in 1923, there was a new scheme added, and you see the totally different density in the housing. Meanwhile, outside of Zlín, the ideas that were cherished before the war seemed to flourish in its aftermath. After 28 October 1918, the very turning point emphasized by Alois Kubíček. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, by Alois Kubíček. The intention to establish a garden city in Czechoslovakia accelerated in several ways. However, there was no systematic approach in pushing the vision through. Several enthusiastic architects, theorists, activists, and initiatives launched their campaigns in the media and society, trying to win not only experts, public opinion, but also potential sympathizers among the authorities. In the first years of Czechoslovakia, and there is the quote, Alois Kubíček, one of co-founders of the Association for Founding a Garden City in Prague, expressed his conviction that, and I quote, democratic times put special emphasis on resolving the housing issue. In democratic times, a good dwelling must not be a property privilege. The greatest right to a good dwelling have especially those classes which, according to statistics, have the largest number of family members. Kubíček meant that the housing issue in a democratic society shall be sorted out regardless of the social status and financial circumstances. Moreover, for Kubíček, the only proper form of a dwelling were family houses with gardens. Apartment blocks would be acceptable only with a limited number of apartments. According to the content of influential architectural journal Still, it was the common opinion that Kubíček shared with many of the acknowledged architects of the period. In 1921, Jan Kotěra published a book with the simple title Workers' Colonies, which presented his own projects of workers' housing together with a brief essay accompanied by a translated digest of the first chapter from Raymond Anvin's classical work, Town Planning in Practice. And it's the quote by Anvin. You see his name is quite invisible in comparison to Kotěra, but still it's present. 3 years later, in 1924, a complete Czech translation of Ebenezer Howard's pamphlet, Garden Cities, of Tomorrow, was published in Czech. Also, other Czech authors and architects such as Vladimír Zákrejs, Alois Kubíček, or František Fabinger contributed to the Garden City movement with their numerous treatises. Theory was followed by practice in a variety of forms of lectures, articles, exhibitions, to name a few. All the endeavors to build a garden city in Czechoslovakia were promoted by many supporters whose names we usually don't associate with the garden city movement, or they don't belong to the history of Czech modern architecture and town planning at all. Despite all the endeavors, the garden city scheme was never implemented in Czechoslovak society in its totality. The radical concept and all the related visions remained reduced to several garden suburbs of more or less spectacular architecture and urban environment. An early example of a garden suburb that was praised to become a model for many others was Ořechovka in Prague, which you see now, and you see the English influence. And as such, it was proudly presented to experts from foreign countries. When Henry Chapman, a representative of the International Garden Cities and Town Planning Federation, visited the Czechoslovak capital in 1924, he was impressed not only by architecture of the new development, but moreover, he praised its stratified social division of the occupants. Yeah, there was the quote, sorry. A feature that would be hardly found in the United Kingdom in those days and even today. Later on, the highly regarded example of Ořechovka was followed by Spořilov or Zahradní město in Prague. The district Zahradní město is a literal translation of garden town. Parallel to establishing garden suburbs, the Czech and later on even some Slovak garden city sympathizers founded an institute for town planning at the Masaryk Academy of Works, an expert department fully dedicated to urban planning and housing issues. The institute was founded in the early 1920s with a vision to study, promote, implement, and develop recent international knowledge on urban and regional planning, and even to establish garden cities. There's a tiny quote on the left. During the 1920s, it was formed by many high-profile architects, technical experts, and influential members of the public administration. Since the initial stage, the institute became an active member of Garden Cities and Town Planning Association that was founded by Ebenezer Howard in 1913 in London. Significantly, the institute was joined by several supporters who had promoted the establishment of garden cities in the vicinity of Prague already before the war, and who continued to advocate the same vision also in the 1920s and 1930s. One of the most active professionals of the institute was Otakar Fielinger, a prolific author, you see one of his books, garden architect, landscape specialist, and urban planner. Otakar Fielinger studied in Vienna, Harvard University, and Ann Arbor in Michigan. Because of his language skills and broad expertise, he represented the Institute for Town Planning at many international conferences. After Czechoslovakia was founded, he was appointed to the Ministry of Public Works, where he became a head of Department of Urban Planning in the 1930s. By then, the Great Depression had hit Czechoslovakia hard, and the authorities were trying to cope with desperately high rates of unemployment. I'm not sure so far if Otakar Fielinger conceived the official housing scheme for the unemployed in Prague, or if he just presented the idea in public, yet the bold intention did receive harsh criticism instantly. As a proper solution of the housing crisis, those are images from a recent exhibition that took place in Prague this summer in the Municipal Museum of Prague, and it was called Chudá Praha, Poor Prague, presenting the slums of the capital. As a proper solution of the housing crisis, the Ministry of Public Works aimed to construct districts for unemployed workers and their families out of Prague. Every family was to receive a simple detached house with a small garden in a newly founded satellite towns. But neither aesthetics nor urban planning were the leading principles of the government objective. The mission of the political representation was twofold. The scheme was meant not only to provide housing, but also a significant source of food for the families in need. Daily work at the private allotments was to replace the lost jobs in the factories during the Great Depression. In the case of workers' colonies, the new dwellings might have secured a higher living standard for the unprivileged classes in comparison to the existing slums, but for the price of their total spatial and social segregation. Furthermore, affordable workers' housing of this kind would be affected by the lacking infrastructures, services, schools, and medical care, regardless of the transport connections to towns. If the developments were eventually completed, then the families living there could have practiced agriculture into certain extents with their limited skills and resources, but it would be highly unfeasible for them to commute to centers of industry if some jobs reappeared. In November 1933, Otakar Fielinger discussed the idea of the workers' colonies in public in Prague. Fielinger's bold proposal received a negative response immediately from the experts in the audience and provoked Karel Teige to articulate an opposing attitude in a pamphlet Zahradní města nezaměstnaných, Garden Cities of the Unemployed. That's one example of the book with a chart calculating number of houses in the slums of Prague. Teige, a respected author and representative of overtly leftist positions in the Czech art world, regarded the official intention as overtly dubious. Firstly, he rejected its particular origins in English garden cities as a principle. In general, the leftist avant-garde neglected the garden city movement in a superficial way for focusing exclusively on the middle class and its housing issues, omitting the unprivileged workers, which in fact is a false interpretation of Howard's objectives. And secondly, comparing the intended settlements to the fascist ideology,
we're in a city.
it's a roundabout. How many times is he gonna come
And they
around?
just go one circle.
Okay. Okay. Comparing the intended settlements to the fascist ideology applied in Italy and Germany in the form of Stadtratssiedlungen, Teige claimed that moving workers to such developments resembled the aim to chain them to the soil. Although not being explicit, Teige meant the Blut und Boden movement, which in fact is a straight political contradiction with the socialist roots of the Garden City movement. It is fair to mention that eventually none of the suggested satellite towns was completed. The schemes remained merely in a form of vision, and the poor workers remained living in the slums. But the tendency towards radical solutions of unemployment and mass housing persisted in the Czechoslovak mentality long after. Neither the Garden City scheme was implemented into the Czechoslovak society in its radical concept, and all the reform intentions remained reduced to several garden suburbs of more or less spectacular architecture and urban environment. Yet the prevailing invisibility of the garden city movement is paved not only by the avant-garde's critique of government policy and a false reading of the Howard's concept, but furthermore is perpetuated by a dismissal of detached houses in general. Jan Evangelista Koula, architect and author, outlined a position of the family house in a trajectory of modern architecture. Koula summarized an attitude of Czech avant-garde who coined a conviction that a family house is not the focal point of architects anymore. The trend of the day has shifted towards large-scale housing schemes with genuine care for apartments or minimal dwelling cells, affordable for anyone, eventually culminating in a form of collective houses. Detached houses were acceptable only in those cases if the structures provided some innovative contribution to the development of modern architecture. Although the architect Koula was able to acknowledge some individual examples of modern family houses, because he also built some of them, for Karel Teige, the subject of his very refusal was not only the detached house itself, but the typology in particular. It represented for him an imprint of a capitalist system and related economic order on one hand, and a traditional family pattern on the other, both principles that he fundamentally rejected. Still, for Teige, there seems to be a very limited difference between the garden cities and garden suburbs. In contrary to Howard's objective to disperse the overcrowded population from slums and to uplift the housing standard of the unprivileged workers, Teige contended that the new developments provided dwellings exclusively for middle-class families. Then the proper way out of the housing crisis was a vision of the collective house, and Teige's attitude was smoothly adopted by the Czech avant-garde movement, paradoxically overseeing the fact that Holmesgarth, one of early enclaves providing residents with shared domestic, recreational and dining facilities, was built already in 1910 and 1913 in the garden city Letchworth. So one of the first collective houses was in a garden city. Thus the garden city movement was superficially reduced solely to the built garden suburbs. In this sense, it became stigmatized in the Czech lands as a mere housing scheme for the bourgeoisie, overtly neglected by the leftist avant-garde and later on by the communist regime. And this ideological position proved to have lasting implications on the examination of interwar housing in Czechoslovakia. Apart its prevailing invisibility, the garden city movement in the Czech lands has left a significant legacy mirroring the upheavals of Czechoslovak modern history. After the communist coup in 1948, any investigation on this particular typology, as well as on modern architecture and town planning in general, became a heretic act under the dominant canon of socialist realism. For the first time since the late 1950s, a few selected representatives of Czech modernism became the subject of art historian examination. The growing interest in the modern movement developed gradually in the late 1970s and 1980s, but it found its climax first in the 1990s, when Czech society identified itself to a certain extent with interwar Czechoslovakia, its democratic political system, and also the visual representation of the period in the heavily cherished functionalist style. As a result of coining the canon, reusing the perspective of the international avant-garde movement, the garden city idea remained a rather uncomfortable bourgeois heritage, although the garden suburbs create highly comfortable dwellings ever since they were founded. As the utopian vision of the garden cities didn't materialize in its totality, and the eventual outcomes of garden city movement in the Czech lands are not marked by many examples of spectacular architecture, they were not explored and incorporated into the leading narrative of Czech modern architecture so far.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a very interesting insight. I did not know from that perspective yet. And yeah, so yes, we're having some new guests. You can just come closer. You don't have to sit in the aisle. Just you can just come closer with the. Yeah, very well. So yeah, I'm just looking quickly at the time. We're about in time for actually the coffee break. So I think for really getting into a proper discussion, we need input from Beate third call as well, I would say. So I just want to ask if there is like some particular questions to the both contributions we heard so far. So any one of you, so I would just like say two, 3 questions, and then we come. Okay, please start.
I have a question to Vendula. I mean, like most of the functionalists, like iconic examples are like family houses, also done by the sort of leftist avant-garde architects. So how does the discussion like think about those villas, sort of?
That's an apparent contradiction between the practice and theory, because architects needed a job, and job might be provided by wealthy clients when the local authorities didn't have the budgeting for building any housing colonies or new districts. So that's very straight response. Baba was a private commission, yeah.
Bata, yeah. For this first round, we're in English, and then later on we can have English and German as we want.
So thank you. Going? Yes. Okay.
Right.
So thank you for the lectures. The lectures which were very interesting, both of them. And I have a question first to Vendula. Or a remark, what you have shown us is very similar to the periodization we have in Germany and we have in Poland too. So after the First World War, the first settlements were garden cities in Germany as well as in Poland, in order to provide housing and quick housing for the great need of housing. So you have, for example, Ernst May, who was working in Silesia and has done the little houses, small houses with the how is it called, stable barns, little stables for animals, and small gardens for getting food and so on. So it's the same thing. And you have a parallel to the Erwerbslosensiedlung for poor people also in the Weimar Republic. At the end of Weimar Republic, you get all this. It's not a Nazi thing. They have exploited it and blood and soil and so on. But after the crisis, the economic crisis of 1921, there has been a lot of projects for Erwerbslosensiedlungen, in order to get people their own grounds to have these little animals and fruits and so on. So it's very, very similar than the thoughts of Vierlinger. Have you found any relationship between those and the Czech propositions? Because I understand that Tiger was a critique very much, and you have some of the critique also in Germany. For example, Adolf Rading has told the same thing, that it's far away from communication. You get the people on the soil, but they don't have any opportunity to get into the town and get into work again and so on. So do you have a relationship between that? And the second question, if I may add this already, it's to Helena, about the argument of national pride for the palace. Was it an argument for the rebuilding in the 17th, for the reconstruction? Too, you have mentioned it in the film, but was it already an argument in the 17th when you got it restored? Thank you.
Okay, who goes first?
Thank you for the question. you are perfectly right. There is exactly the same periodization, and when I started my project, I had like a working hypothesis that everything that was familiar among the Czech architects about the Garden City movement was actually translated from German resources, because majority of them was familiar with German language. Apart from English, there were only few who spoke English fluently to be able to get the knowledge from the United Kingdom. But recently I found out that it's not that direct transfer from Germany or from Austria to the Czech lands, but there were also some links direct from the kingdom into Czechoslovakia. But the periodization is very similar, because as Ernst May was in the office of Ebenezer Howard or Raymond Unwin, he was very familiar with the development there and then returned with the knowledge. The Czechs were visiting the island and they were visiting Letchworth. I assume that even Jan Kotěra went there when he was in the United Kingdom in 1904 and 1905, so that he had a chance to visit the first garden city in England. And of course, they wanted to be international in the meaning that they wanted to fulfill the objectives of the International Federation for Garden Cities and Town Planning. So they were getting the latest information, what's going on, and it makes sense that it was the same time as their German friends.
Please the microphone, because we're recording.
I'm thinking about the period of 1930 after the crisis. That's my question. Did they look at the Erwerbslosensiedlung in Germany to create those Vierlinger-Siedlungen? So.
I don't have any documents about that so far, because I'm like the first one who explores the archives. So there is like no preliminary study on the topic. I'm pioneering it actually. And being based in Birmingham, it's difficult for me to do the research in the Czech archives, but I will go into the files and I'm sure they knew about that perfectly.
So Helena.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the reconstruction. I mean, it was a difficult situation. Well, it is now 1970s, so it's not functionalism anymore. It's the post-war architecture. So, like when the palace burned out, there were like new high-rises commissioned for the offices. So there was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 new like sort of high-rises built in this like modernist or late modernist style. Then with the reappreciation of functionalism, so like when I was speaking, I mean this is not researched so well, so when I was speaking with the architect Emil Přikryl about that, it was more that like, this palace was sort of forgotten, and that all of the architects actually focused on these like new constructions of these high-rises. So it was only maybe like the own explanation that comes to my mind why it was not demolished was that there was like really some kind of a monument, maybe for the sort of identity that was connected with the First Republic and with the achievements that the First Republic had, and maybe that's why it didn't get demolished, and then eventually it was reused for the gallery, because otherwise, I mean, if one would only like take these like arguments with with this ruined landscape, I mean, you wouldn't probably reconstruct it for such immense cost. And I have to say that with the socialist state, I mean, even though there were like many things that were not quite positive, I mean, there were like really big public constructions going on, including the Federal Assembly, new theater buildings, and so on and so forth, like a lot of embassies, that the socialist state was actually like able to perform, whereas the New Republic after 1989 has not been able to perform. Like that, there has, like in a recent discussion, it came out that there was no large public building constructed in Prague for this 30-year period. So like even though the socialism was a system with like really problematic moments, these large funds were really directed into like some public construction and also the renovation, because like in some kind of a capitalist system, I don't think that the state would come up with such a large budget of money to, you know, because it sort of counters the logic, you know. Yeah, and we are actually witnessing it constantly with like 70s and 60s buildings being torn down in Prague, because they counter the logic of like new office buildings and new developments. So yeah, so I think it's a interesting situation of the place the building had in the history, like overall, and also the constellation of the system and the possibility of actually funding the renovation, which really took about 15 years. Which I mean, sure, it's slow, but it was also an immense building. So like you being like a businessman, you know, you wouldn't fund a reconstruction for 15 years. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for these questions and 2 answers. I'm back. I just had to check some chair problem over there, but we solved it. So yeah, as we would be perfectly in time for our break, if there's no other question right now to these 2 lectures, I would like follow our agenda to have like the real discussion after the 3rd contribution and in the 2nd table talk round. Yeah, for those who just like came in at the moment, we had 2 contributions about the Prague National Gallery and garden city movement in Czechoslovakia, and now we're about to have a break. So I will all of you invite you for a coffee and I think some small stuff, and we all still have soup, and so we will be back here in about 15 minutes. Now enjoy the breaks. Thank you so much for your contributions. It was very interesting.